This poem is called An Autobiography in 5 Short Chapters by Portia Nelson. Chapter 1. I walk down the street. There is a deep hole in the sidewalk. I fall in. I am lost. I am hopeless. It isn't my fault. It takes forever to find a way out. Chapter 2. I walk down the same street. There is a deep hole in the sidewalk. I pretend I don't see it. I fall in again. I can't believe I'm in this same place, but it isn't my fault. It still takes a long time to get out. Chapter 3. I walk down the same street. There is a deep hole in the sidewalk. I see it is there. I still fall in. It's a habit. My eyes are open. I know where I am. It is my fault. I get out immediately. Chapter 4. I walk down the same street. There is a deep hole in the sidewalk. I step around it. Chapter 5. I walk down another street. Unitarian Universalists, we don't have a creed, a unifying creed which our members are required to believe. Instead, we are joined together in covenant, and we articulate our shared values through our 7 principles. And there's some great stuff in our principles: the inherent worth and dignity of every person, justice, equity, and compassion in human relations, respect for the interdependent web of all existence. But this morning, I want to focus on our 3rd principle: acceptance of one another and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations. So, what does spiritual growth mean in a religion where we have such varying beliefs that are represented in our mobile off to my left, and yet this is not the encapsulation of all the beliefs we may even hold here? This is a place where we have different ideas about a higher power, which we call by many names: God, Goddess, Spirit of life, and that which is beyond all naming. And where some of us might not even believe in any sort of higher power. So what does spiritual growth mean in the context of Unitarian Universalism? A living tradition that welcomes a variety of spiritual truths and draws from many sources. There are, in addition to our 7 principles, what I think often gets short shrift is that we actually also have 6 sources that we pull from as inspiration. Direct experience of that transcending mystery and wonder, affirmed in all cultures, which moves us to a renewal of the spirit and an openness to the forces which create and uphold life. Words and deeds of prophetic people which challenge us to confront powers and structures of evil with justice, compassion, and the transforming power of love. Wisdom from the world's religions which inspires us in our ethical and spiritual life. Jewish and Christian teachings which call us to respond to God's love by loving our neighbors as ourselves. Humanist teachings which counsel us to heed the guidance of reason and the results of science and warn us against idolatries of the mind and spirit. And spiritual teachings of earth-centered traditions which celebrate the sacred circle of life and instruct us to live in harmony with the rhythms of nature. With such diverse beliefs and sources, the Reverend Rob Hardy's writes that for us, spiritual growth isn't so much about a vertical ascent to heaven, but about growth in every direction at once. It's spirituality in 3D. Growth in spirit doesn't measure one's proximity to God above, but rather the spaciousness of one's own soul, he says. Its volume, its capacity, its size. So spiritual growth can mean growing in all sorts of ways. In being more compassionate, more grounded, more patient, more courageous. Maybe it means being more joyous, more present, more supportive, more flexible, more giving, more grateful, more creative, more loving to others, more loving to ourselves. So, what areas of growth are important to you will be different than for others. We know to some degree the ways in which we need to grow. We often just need the support to do it, whether it comes from the teachings of different traditions, or I think more importantly, and I'll get to this in more depth a little bit later, the importance of growing together in community. So after I had already started planning the service, I noticed that last year on this same Sunday, the second Sunday in April, I led a service with a similar theme called Growth Doesn't Always Come Easy. And I guess there's something about this season when new growth is evident in the natural world, when new shoots are growing up and new buds are appearing on the trees, that really seems to inspire growth in me. It's a time to reflect and look at those areas that have been lying dormant, been lying uncared for, that I need to grow into. And of course, spiritual growth is always an evergreen topic, one that is always ripe for reflection. And part of the reason is that growth doesn't always come easy. Sometimes growth is a lifelong process that's never actually finished. Now, one of those things I talked about in that sermon last year was a conversation I had with my spiritual director about how I've known I needed to grow in a particular area of my life for a long time and have wanted to grow, yet each time I try to change, I kept finding myself basically where I started. I had this sense that growth would never happen, but our conversation convinced me of the possibility to grow. If I really wanted it. If I was committed to it. Well, coincidentally enough, just a few weeks ago, I was talking to my spiritual director again, and the same area of growth came up. It was still something I was struggling with. But this time, it felt like I was making progress. It was slow progress, to be sure, but it was progress. It seemed like I was closer to chapter 3 of my autobiography. I walk down the same street. There's a deep hole in the sidewalk. I see it is there. I still fall in. It's a habit. My eyes are open. I know where I am. It's my fault. I get out immediately. Admittedly, sometimes it still takes a little longer to climb out of the hole, but it's faster than it used to be. And on rare occasions, I was even skillful enough to move on to chapter 4 and walk around that hole in the sidewalk. And what it took was my commitment to growth, a desire to change, and the belief that I could. And a lot of that desire to grow came out of years and years of frustration, of being hindered, of falling short, and seeing the ways that created harm for me and for those around me in my life. How much suffering must one endure before we decide, this isn't working for me? How much suffering before we're ready to grow, to take responsibility for our own actions, to learn to climb out of that hole more quickly, and to finally avoid it altogether. Sometimes that impetus to grow builds up over years, and sometimes it comes all at once. Often it's the circumstances and situations that upend our lives that can be the greatest catalyst for growth if we only let them. It might be a major illness or the loss of someone close to us, which causes us to reevaluate the way we're living our lives. It could be moving to a new place without the familiar support systems, which forces us to find inner strength we had not tapped into before. It could be the election of a politician that causes us to rise up and take risks that we might not have taken otherwise. It could be the crisis that we collectively face as a planet that forces us to rethink our diets, our jobs, our consumption, and the way we live our lives. It could be not letting terrorist attacks and violence turn us towards hatred and retribution, but to love even more deeply and fiercely. And I think that a Unitarian Universalist church like Emerson has a lot to offer in the way of growth. Part of it is that being able to draw from different sources. Just looking at the past few Sunday services, I love being part of a religious tradition that allows us to draw from Greek philosophers and the Buddha one week, and Judaism and Taoism the next. The Easter story, the civil rights movement, and earth-centered spirituality the week after that. And this morning to draw from the Sufi poet Rumi, ancient folk tales, and a poem by an ex-Mormon cabaret singer who wrote that poem about the 5 chapters of her autobiography, as well as our own Unitarian Universalist tradition. And that's just 4 services. There's so much richness, so much wisdom to be found. And I think we can take pride in that. Although, one thing that I think many of us may have some growing to do, not all of us, but many of us, is that first part of that third principle. That acceptance of one another in the encouragement to spiritual growth when it comes to our religious beliefs. You know, sometimes it's complicated being in a church. We like to take pride in having all these beliefs, but sometimes we might not agree with the beliefs that the person sitting next to us in our pew might have. We may think that their thoughts are a little bit too theistic, or not theistic enough, or just a little bit too woo-woo. And I think it's important, though, for us to recognize that for that person sitting next to us, that is exactly what we need, and to honor that, and to recognize that. And I think one of the things that actually gets in the way of that sometimes is, for many of us, we come from religious traditions that have wounded us, or just growing up in this country, we've been exposed to religions that have been used to wound us, to harm. And so that woundedness that we bring into this space, it affects our views of these other religions and gives us a kind of skewed perspective. Because the reality is that here in this church, as long as we have, it doesn't matter exactly what we believe, as long as we all agree, and we do agree to uphold the values of justice and equity and compassion and inclusion and diversity. And so I think there's a learning that's there. And honestly, and this was so important for me in seminary, being exposed to all these different religious traditions, and particularly someone who did not grow up in the Christian faith, and sometimes responded in reaction to it because of how predominant it is in the wider culture, that when I actually took classes and read through the Hebrew Bible and the Christian scriptures, I was like, man, there is a lot of really good stuff in here. There's some other parts that I could certainly, I'd be glad to leave behind. But there's so much in there that's rich. And that's the beauty of all of these different religious traditions coming together and cross-pollinating with each other. If we're a religion that is just a monoculture orchard, it's boring, and it's not resilient. It's not beautiful. But if we can start to plant other trees amongst them of different varieties and different species, they start to cross-pollinate and create new, beautiful things, like the Christian whose spirituality is actually deepened by their engagement with Buddhism. It's so wonderful, so powerful, so amazing. And I think the other thing I want to say, for those of us who are wounded, who come from other traditions, that often there's a tendency to want to just take that tree and just tear it, just cut it right down and plant some new seeds and start over. But the reality is that those roots and those limbs and those branches, there's actually a lot of beautiful, wonderful wisdom there. And those roots don't go quickly. So if you cut down the tree, you lose that strength. You lose that grounding, that foundation. So maybe what we need to do for some of us is to think of our old religions, that tree. And for some of us, that may mean we need to prune off a few branches here and there and that don't work. Maybe for some of us, that's taking off some major limbs. And, I think the great thing is we can graft new things onto that. That's the beauty about trees, is you can, take a cut, put a little wedge in it, and then stick something in from a new tree. And all of a sudden, if you've got fruit trees, you can have 4 or 5 different types of fruit. And isn't that so much more amazing than just one tree? And for some of us, it may be that we need to take it pretty damn close down to that stump. I mean, that may be the reality, but you can even do that. There are trees that grow that way and that produce. And in fact, sometimes trees are renewed and enriched by the chopping down of old growth and grafting that new growth on. And so I think there's a lot of wisdom there. So I think that's one of the great things about Unitarian Universalism. And indeed, that has been one of the things that throughout our history, throughout our heritage of over 200 years here in these United States, has been kind of our heresy, this openness to different beliefs, this openness to rationality and reason and freedom and equality. But the reality is, and this is another area I see of growth for us, is that those things that at one point were heresies are now actually a little bit more commonplace. You can look around at the world and people are already taking from these different sources. Anyone can go home and look up a text about, you can pick up the Tao Te Ching or the Hebrew Bible, the Torah, and read from that. You can pick up a book of poetry by the Persian poet Hafez, or the writings of a Buddhist teacher like Thich Nhat Hanh, or read the transcendentalist texts like Thoreau's Walden or Whitman's Leaves of Grass. So there's all these different sources, and so many people are taking that, and I think that's wonderful, and I think that's great. And so in some ways, that means for Unitarian Universalists, if we are to be meaningful and to carry on that radical heritage of our forebears, I think the new area of growth for us is to live more deeply into community. Because that pick and choose, this is the part that works for me, I like this part, you can do that in the comfort of your own home, that kind of self-service faith. But the reality is, friends, you can't be religious alone. Being religious requires community. It's in that cross-pollination with each other, in getting to know each other's lives, each other's struggles, in that rubbing up, that friction that always happens in relationship. That is where we grow. And so how wonderful to be part of a religious community that provides us the space, the container for us to make that growth together. Not always easily, not perfectly, not without feelings getting hurt, but the knowledge that we covenant to come together to build community and to recreate bonds when those bonds are broken, to create healing, which is part of the work that we're doing in developing this covenant of right relations. That's this ongoing process in which I'm so grateful for. So I think that for us, spiritual growth in this day and age is to move more towards that sense of community, so that we can take that growth that we have here amongst each other and bring it out into the wider world. And so if you're interested in going a little bit deeper, in exploring that spiritual growth in a religious community, in community, supporting each other, challenging each other, growing, I hope you'll join me in a class that we're going to be offering in May. It's a 6-week class called Spirit and Practice. And we're going to be exploring different spiritual practices that affirm our religious diversity while seeking unity in our communal quest for meaning and wholeness, regardless of whatever spiritual path you follow. Whether you identify as humanist or Jewish or Christian or agnostic or atheist, Buddhist, pagan, theist, mystic, or any of the other diverse paths that we follow in Unitarian Universalism. This class will offer a forum for learning, sharing, and growth that will enrich our faith journeys together. And it's equally suitable for those of you who may be here for the very first time, as well as longtime members who've grown up in this faith. And over the course of this class, we'll be exploring a wide variety of spiritual practices, like meditation and journaling and prayer, which are kind of the personal spiritual practices that we often think of when we think of spiritual practices, but it's also a lot more. So we'll be exploring 7 different types of spiritual practices as well. Spiritual partnerships, intentional companions on the journey of spiritual development, and communal worship. Mind practices that stimulate our intellect, body practices such as Tai Chi or yoga or walking or running, sitting, gardening, or anything that reconnects us to our body. Soul practices that exercise our creative selves, like painting or music or poetry. And life practices, which means taking our spiritual practices and bringing them out into our relationships, out into our workplaces, and into our interactions with strangers. And finally, justice practices, which remind us that the spiritual maturity requires us to stretch beyond personal transformation towards a vision of transforming the world. So friends, I invite you to keep seeking that growth. Though it may be challenging, though it may be hard, it is worthwhile. It is worth it. I invite you too to turn to each other, knowing that growth is easier together, in community, together. May it be so.